thank you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to give an online, lecture. And then this is, Professor Lawrence King in the LSE. And then it's a great pleasure, to have you on our program one more time. And then you have 15 minutes, for talk. And then we will have, 15 minutes, Q&A session afterwards. Okay, floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about the verbal threats that North Korea makes in relation to its nuclear security program. And we're going to think a little bit about how North Korea uses these threats to try to communicate information about their nuclear security. So I'm an assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, primarily working on nuclear security issues. And I want to start out with a little bit of background on North Korea's nuclear program. This should likely be familiar to the audience, but just to set the scene, our current open source intelligence estimates suggest that North Korea's nuclear program contains around 30 to 60 nuclear warheads, and North Korea has increasingly been focused on developing tactical capabilities, so miniaturizing, lightening, and standardizing their nuclear weapons program. And North Korea has made threats about a rapid expansion of this program over the next couple of years. It remains to be seen how capable they actually are of fulfilling that, but it gives us a sense of what their goals are for development. Most of the focus that we see now in North Korea's nuclear program is not about expanding the number of weapons, but improving their existing delivery systems. So a keystone of North Korea's nuclear delivery system is its ICBM capabilities, which now are quite long range and able to strike anywhere in the continental United States, although there are still struggles with precision. North Korea has other types of delivery capabilities, including short and medium range missiles, as well as artillery, and is working on improving the success of these systems with solid fuel propellants, better satellite guidance, and improved in-flight maneuverability to try to address risks related to, for example, missile defense. And North Korea's nuclear arsenal has a quite unusual doctrine. North Korea has declared formally that its nuclear arsenal has an irreversible status, suggests their unwillingness to compromise on the persistence of the program. North Korea's doctrine argues that nuclear weapons are primarily used for defending the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and fundamental interests of the state. Now, this is not too different from other major nuclear states, but where the major doctrinal differences do appear are on the conditions under which North Korea claims it would be legitimate to use nuclear weapons. So, as is typical for all nuclear states, North Korea reserves a right to a nuclear second strike, meaning if North Korea were attacked with nuclear assets, it could retaliate in kind. But North Korea also has some more forward-leaning conditions for nuclear use, including an explicit condition around preemption, where North Korea argues if it perceives imminent and pending attacks on strategic assets, and especially the chain of command and control, that it might retaliate with nuclear weapons. And the reason to have this preemption clause is in part concerns about leadership decapitation. So this allows North Korea to argue that if key leaders were taken out, its nuclear weapons would come into play. North Korea has two conditions for the use of nuclear weapons in conventional warfare. One of these is taking initiative in crisis, a phrase that most scholars have interpreted to be about escalation dominance, that is, to maintain the flow of a conventional conflict and to try to decouple U.S. interests from South Korean interests if there were a high level of contestation. And finally, North Korea argues that it can use nuclear weapons in the event of a catastrophic crisis to the existence of the state. And this is similar to language in Russian nuclear doctrine about the use of nuclear weapons to preserve the vital interest and existence of the Russian state. And this phrasing suggests that North Korea is trying to deter large-scale conventional aggression and could potentially use these weapons if it felt like it was losing a conventional conflict. So now that we have some background information about what North Korea's capabilities are and what its doctrine is, we want to understand a little bit about what these threats to use nuclear weapons actually mean and how we might be able to understand when North Korea is seriously considering the use of nuclear weapons or other types of escalation. And so the project I'm going to be talking about today is research that I've done that tries to answer this question: should North Korea's nuclear threats be taken as cheap talk, or are they more serious signals of North Korea's intention? And the argument that I'll make here is that the individual threats we see coming from North Korea might not be individually meaningful. One single nuclear threat doesn't tell us that much information. But if we look in aggregate at patterns in these threats, then we can understand important elements of North Korea's strategic thinking. That is, the arguments, the ideas that come up frequently in North Korea's rhetoric tell us a little bit about where the strategic priorities lie, and we can look at patterns in the frequency of threats over time to predict and understand when North Korea will take provocative action. And the underlying idea here is that when North Korea makes threats, we can use that to predict when they'll take costly or risky behaviors, such as testing new nuclear delivery systems or even nuclear weapons themselves. To do this, I'm going to look at threats coming from the North Korean regime. And so I'm going to collect English language articles from KCNA, a North Korean newspaper, back to the late 1990s. And this gives me a data set of about 124,000 documents of English language North Korean media, which are intended to signal to international audiences the idea with these English language publications. So they're going to be read by analysts abroad, and many of these are particularly targeted at an American audience. The closeness of KCNA with the regime tells us that there's some intentional communication going on here, although of course it's not a perfect relationship. And then we're going to look at how those affect provocations. So looking at cross-border military incidents, as well as nuclear provocations. So that's mostly nuclear tests and missile tests. To identify from those KCNA articles when North Korea makes threats, I use a machine learning technique that automatically processes the rhetoric and sorts it into various categories that come up frequently in North Korean media. One of these categories, which you see in the bottom in red, are instances where North Korea makes threats against its adversaries. But it talks about lots of other things, from economic conditions to North Korean ideology and even culture, talking about things like festivals, sports, and schools. We can zoom here a little bit into the category from that topic model of threats that North Korea makes, and you can see some of the common words that characterize when North Korea is making threats. You see that many of these are aimed at the United States, but they also use militaristic language like nuclear, military, war, etc. So to validate that this method is actually identifying threats, I use a process where I assign articles to the topic that they most closely match, and then I randomly sample and hand code, so qualitatively, analytically read and analyze articles that my algorithm thinks are threats. And it turns out that 100% of the articles that are sampled that the machine learning process expected to be threats, in fact, contained threats. And so I have some examples of the types of threats that North Korea makes here. So we have an if-then type threat, such as even a single shell dropped on the Korean Peninsula might lead to the outbreak of a new world war, a thermonuclear war. And we also have implicit threats that are a little more vague or don't have specific trigger conditions, like this one. We consider the US no more than a lump which we can beat to a jelly anytime. So what triggers North Korean threats? I find two main topics that appear frequently in this rhetoric. The first has to do with joint military exercises. So just over a third of North Korea's threats speak about various joint military exercises, sometimes naming specific exercises, like you can see here, the reference to the Full Eagle and Freedom Guardian and Focus Lens series of exercises, whereas others may talk more generally about interoperability and exercises that occur primarily between South Korea and the United States, but also in response to more multilateral exercises that South Korea participates in. Almost half of the threats that North Korea makes are explicitly nuclear threats. So North Korea suggests that they'll use nuclear weapons, and they focus on areas of contestation that make their nuclear arsenal vulnerable. So one area that comes up quite frequently are North Korea's concerns about preemption and preventative action that the ROK or the United States could take. So, for example, almost 21% of North Korea's threats are in response to concerns about preventative action. And so we can see part of the core goal for North Korea's nuclear arsenal is to try to stave off these potentialities. So what does the rhetoric actually have to do with North Korea's behavior? Are these threats just empty threats, or do they tell us something about what North Korea is going to do? Well, I argue that North Korea makes many threats. In fact, my data finds that on average, North Korea makes 48 English language threats in KCNA every month. What I do find is that patterns in when these threats occur have a lot to do with what North Korea's actual behavior is. So we can see here a graph that on the x-axis shows us the distance from a provocation that has to do with nuclear weapons or nuclear delivery vehicles. And on the y-axis shows the mean number of articles in KCNA that day that would contain threats against North Korea's adversaries. And what this figure is showing us is that in the ramp-up period before provocative action, North Korea is increasingly likely to make a higher number of threats, and that those threats peak right before North Korea takes one of these provocative actions and then declines in response to that behavior. Now, the reason to do this is for North Korea to communicate to its adversaries that it's unhappy with the status quo, that there's some triggering factor that creates strategic anxiety in North Korea and may demand some sort of action to demonstrate resolve and try to, in the sort of American terminology, restore deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. So it's not just the case that these two patterns move together, that threats and provocations occur simultaneously, but also that these threats precede and therefore have a signaling component that has to do with patterns of provocations. So, for example, we can use the number of articles that KCNA includes making threats per month to predict whether or not North Korea is going to engage in a nuclear-related provocation. So we see here on the x-axis the number of articles per month where North Korea makes threats, and on the y-axis, the likelihood that the month includes a provocation. You can see that as we get more and more articles coming out of KCNA that make threats, North Korea is increasingly likely, up to a sort of plateau point at above maybe 100 threats per month, North Korea is increasingly likely to engage in some sort of provocation. And so we can use these to help understand the behavior. It also tells us that North Korea isn't just sort of randomly or systematically using these threats to try to change the information environment. There is also some intentionality behind this behavior. We can use a similar approach using regression analysis to predict not just the concurrency of threats and provocations, but also the linear pattern of behavior. And so we can see, for example, that threats predict not only whether a provocation will occur in the same week, but are actually better predictors of whether or not we'll see provocations in the following week. And we can change this period of time. The research that I'm referencing as I talk today uses all sorts of variations, everything from trying to predict 1 day out to maybe 10 days out, 14 days out, a month out. And we find the same pattern of behavior. A standard deviation increase in the number of threats increases the probability of a missile or nuclear provocation by somewhere between 11 and 19%, depending on the model that we use. So what I want to reiterate here is that we can view these threats, which come quite frequently and might otherwise look a bit like straw men, maybe that North Korea is crying wolf, or doesn't really have any particular direction. We can actually analyze these threats systematically to try to reveal information about how North Korea perceives and responds to their threat environment. So the content in aggregate of North Korea's threats will point more regularly to key areas that North Korea is thinking about in their strategic analysis, and in particular shows areas of vulnerability for the North Korean regime. They're quite concerned about military exercises, in part because they demonstrate a closeness between South Korea and its allies that would be necessary or at least extremely helpful if South Korea were to end up in a conflict with its northern neighbor. And in addition, we see frequent focus on challenges to North Korea's nuclear program, both related to preemption, but also defensive action like missile defenses that could undercut the effectiveness of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. And it's not just the content of these threats that matter, but patterns over time in when and how many threats North Korea is making. So though threats are frequent, frequency patterns reveal when North Korea has higher levels of resolve and is willing to take more risky actions. That is, North Korea makes threats when they feel vulnerable, and this is also the process that leads them to engage in risky provocative behaviors such as testing missiles or even testing nuclear weapons. And the result of that is that we can use threats to systematically predict North Korea's provocations. And we can see that this rhetoric coming out of North Korea, these threats, although they're quite common, although any individual threat may only tell us so much about North Korea's thinking, this rhetoric that looks really cheap can actually be meaningful if we can analyze it in a systematic and scientific way. So I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about North Korean threats or provocations. Thank you.
All right, great. Dr. Sukin, great and a very succinct and scientific research. Yeah, I like that very much. You've been using machine learning technology, and that actually fits into this the description of scientific research in political science these days. Thank you. And then I have a few questions related to your lecture. And more say policy dimensions. You are emphasizing policy implications for that. So what is policy implications for the South Korea and the United States? The North Korea actually seriously use signaling tactic to aggregate level, not individual probably. So it's a more signaling accumulate about 10 days and 1 month. Then South Korea and the United States and Japan and the People's Republic of China should notice this is going to something happen. So what's the implication for that?
So there are several key implications here. One key takeaway is those who are analyzing North Korean behavior should in fact pay attention to these signals. This isn't new. Lots of military State Departments read North Korea's rhetoric. I think it's often difficult to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, and understand what North Korea is actually saying. I offer a methodological approach, I think, to kind of look in aggregate and see what's referenced most frequently. Now, what does that help us understand? It helps us understand what North Korea sees as the key vulnerabilities in its own military strategy. And that gives us different pathways for moving forward. So, for example, if North Korea is very concerned about preemption, about surprise attacks, then that means it's important when actions are taken from the US or South Korea that could have a risk of that sort of surprise attack or preemption activity, that there is some effort made to communicate that these are defensive maneuvers, that these sort of apocalyptic scenarios that North Korea is imagining are not in fact going to happen. So to give a concrete example, one of the things North Korea often talks about when they talk about their concern on military exercises is that military exercises close to the border are actually covers for an incoming invasion. And other elements of my research suggest that when the same exercises are conducted offshore, they're conducted further away from the border, then North Korea's reactions are much quieter to those exact same activities. Right? So if an exercise is being conducted for interoperability purposes and doesn't require, say, detailed knowledge of terrain near the border, moving those exercises physically can help relieve some of that pressure and reduce the likelihood of miscalculation or maybe even accidents, escalation, and that sort of behavior on the North Korea's side.
Do you think in South Korea and then American, Korean and American and probably Japanese, are they aware of this North Korean signaling tactics?
So I think there are mixed views within the sort of scholarly and intelligence communities here. I think there's a tendency to suggest that North Korea is not actually revealing its intentions, even if they are trying to signal that they're unhappy, that it's strategic and that they're trying to manipulate the behavior of their adversaries. And to some degree, this is true, right? You signal in order to try to stop some event from happening. There's a deterrence component to this signaling. What I'm arguing is that this isn't some random program of manipulation. If it were, what we would expect is the same degree of vitriol for every exercise. North Korea would always sort of escalate to its maximum possible rhetoric. And that's not really the case. North Korea is making these very extreme threats, but how many they make, how extreme they are, how condensed they are, that's varying. And that sort of variation doesn't really have any purpose other than signaling real intentions. So I think we have to maybe go a little bit further than some previous analysis has said in suggesting that the signaling is not just a manipulation tactic, but that there are also real security concerns. Right? And we might think of North Korea as facing this particularly intense security dilemma. They have, from their perspective, threats on all sides, which they constantly have to be vigilant about. And so they have this very tight incentive to try to make sure that they are monitoring and communicating about those threats at all times. But because of the intensity of that threat, the intensity of the rhetoric, it's easy to kind of dismiss this behavior as maybe just an unusual quirk of a particularly aggressive regime.
From comparative, political, methodology point of view, and do you see any other comparable cases in other part of the world? North Korea actually doing, I mean,
Yeah.
Singapore is a very, very big, field, in political science, international security, but I'm just curious.
So I've done some work recently working with NATO on understanding Russia's nuclear threats and have a similar argument I think we can make there. Russia, of course, now makes semi-frequent nuclear threats, not nearly approaching the frequency of North Korea, but we can still see variations in Russian rhetoric between threats that are kind of made once and then never really repeated versus threats that come up really frequently and actually do seem to capture some real issues, some kind of critical attention that Russia has. I think one of the key differences that we see there between those sort of low-level threats and high-level threats are the deterrent threats, saying, for example, NATO should not send forces into Ukraine. Those are much more powerful than compellant threats saying, maybe NATO should take some action. And we see the same thing in North Korea's behavior too. The deterrent threats, don't escalate from a military exercise, don't initiate a preemptive activity. Those threats are relatively compelling and they're repeated very often. North Korea also makes lots of compellant threats. South Korea and the United States should no longer cooperate with each other. Japan should apologize for past behavior. Not only do those things not happen, of course, but they're much less frequent. And so I think we see North Korea understands their limitations to what its nuclear arsenal can do. It can deter, but it can't compel. It can't change the shape of geopolitics in the way that maybe North Korea might want it to.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.